Edward Bernays, he was Freud's nephew. So he was living in America at the start of the 1900s. And this man has had a huge impact on every single one of you. I guarantee it. And it is wild that a lot of people don't know who he is or what he has done. But very simply, Edward Bernays was very close to his uncle, Sigmund Freud. And he was the person who kind of combined psychology and business. And he was the first. So imagine in the 1920s, when we look at consumerism and what people were buying and basically how people like purchased goods, the priority, especially in America, it was needs based. What this means effectively was that people were buying things that they needed. Like, of course, you always had the very rich people, this kind of decadence and opulence and all of this, of course. But for the mass majority, most people were buying things that they actually needed. And as a result, they were a larger part of the market. When we looked at products and what those products meant, it was very much about quality, right? So in the kind of capitalist game where like whoever makes the best product wins the market, then there was a giant push for high quality products. So for example, this shirt will last you 30 years, this car will last you 50 years, and so on and so on and so on. That was where it was going. But the problem with this was that there was a massive fear within businesses because this is the time of mass production. So there were lots of factories that were able to make lots of products very quickly. However, there was a fear that if we are creating products very, very quickly, and one product, albeit, then what happens when we fulfill everyone's needs? What happens when people stop buying things? We go out of business. So this was a real fear for a long time, not just in the 20s, this continued for a while with mass production, is that we can make a lot of the same thing, but what happens when everyone's got everything they need? So this was the biggest issue within business. And this is where Edward Bernays comes in, because basically what he was telling businesses, using his uncle's kind of psychology, was that you should sell desires, not needs. Sell people what they want, not what they actually need. And this is the main push of his kind of philosophy towards this. So, for example, the head of Big Tobacco in America contacted Bernays in the 1920s and said, we have this giant problem with cigarettes and selling cigarettes in America because everybody smoked in the 1920s. But when I say everybody, I mean every man, because pretty much all men and boys and teenagers were smoking. That wasn't an issue. But there was this social thing that had happened where men had decided that if women smoke, it was kind of low, like low class. So a woman who smoked was kind of like very low status and not the kind of woman you want to kind of associate with and so on. And this was a completely social construct, but men smoked, and if women smoked, it was nasty. And Big Tobacco hated this because, women are 50% of the market. So 50% of the market was just not smoking because of this social thing. So they turned to Bernays and they were like, how do we solve this? How do we get women smoking? And Bernays basically followed his kind of uncle's example. He went to psychoanalysts and asked them, what do you think about this? Why is it that where's this coming from, this social stigma? And basically what the psychoanalyst explained is that cigarettes represented the penis. And it was a symbol of male power. Now, if you know anything about Freudian psychology, you will know that a lot of it is about sexuality, and Freud had a really weird relationship with sex, deeply troubling, which we'll come back to later. But a lot of this was about sex, as they assumed, and basically the psychoanalysts said, by smoking, women could have their own penises and challenge male power. And this is the way that you would basically influence women to smoke, as making it a kind of symbol of liberation or challenging male power, becoming rebellious, independence, and so on, right? And so that's exactly what they did. And Bernays set this thing up where he contacted some kind of suffragettes who was like a kind of female liberation movement at the time. He said, I need you to be in this one place and I want you just to start smoking. Simple as that. Then he went to media, newspaper outlets, journalists, and said, the suffragettes are going to do this dramatic like sign of rebellion. They're going to light torches of freedom. And like the journalists had no idea what was going to happen, but it was going to be big and it was going to be life-changing and so on. And Bernays had it all set up. So the women were at the place at the right time. They smoked. The photographers, the journalists were there. He'd already given them this logic of like torches of freedom, because the psychoanalysts were like, that's how you're going to kind of capture this spirit. And it was wildly, wildly successful. So suddenly cigarettes became associated with freedom and liberty and all of this stuff, which obviously they have nothing to do with that. Smoking doesn't make you any freer. Smoking doesn't make you any more equal. But that was the message that they sent. It was wildly, wildly successful. And this is one of the first examples of where psychology and association with brands and products began. And it was all this man, Bernays. And it did not stop there. So Bernays is also responsible for celebrity endorsements. This wasn't a thing until the 1920s. He basically would get celebrities to promote products. And then by buying the product, you could get closer to that celebrity. It doesn't make any sense, but that's what they did. And obviously, as we know, wildly successful. He was also the guy that kind of created the concept of cars as a sex symbol. By having a car, you know, for a guy, it's like a sex symbol, and women will find you more attractive if you drive certain cars and so on. That was him. He created independent medical studies. And by independent, what I mean is he would pay psychoanalysts and doctors to write a medical review of a product and say, yes, this is obviously good for you. And then he would say that that was an independent study, that it wasn't paid for. That was Bernays. He created women's magazines, fashion magazines. Cosmopolitan was one of his big clients. So all the things we have about like female fashion and this kind of standard of female fashion, and that like women talking about women's fashion. So that was Bernays. He literally invented women's magazines. He was big on retail trading as well. He did a big campaign where basically encouraging Americans to buy and sell shares and stocks, and that your average American was intelligent enough and should be more connected to the market, and really encourage people to buy shares. He was responsible for expressing personality through fashion. This was him. It wasn't really a thing actually in the 1920s. Of course, there's always been different types of fashion and clothing, but he really pushed this idea of like wearing this certain hat was like you were a kind of a certain type of person, or you could express yourself wearing different things. You know, you should stand out from the crowd, things like that. And he basically invented PR. Everything we've discussed goes into politics as well. And he is the godfather of PR. He created it himself. We don't have time and we won't be going into too much of the politics today, but all of this applies to politics as well. He was very, very close to the US government. So as you can imagine, Bernays made an incredible amount of money from this, because everything behind this kind of marketing campaigns, he was a client. So Cosmopolitan was a client, Lucky Strike was a client, Ford, General Motors, they were clients. So there was always an incentive. They were selling this stuff. You know, he was working for businesses and finding out, you know, what's the best way to sell this product. And you may say, well, yeah, Mike, of course, that's marketing, that's capitalism. But there is a problem with all of this. And there's a much darker secret that lies kind of behind Bernays' approach. And that's largely because of his uncle. So Freudian psychology is not good psychology, long story short. It's not something that we should trust. Reason being is that Freud hated people. And the guy was there during World War I in Austria. He saw the absolute worst in humanity. And a lot of his conclusions about people were not good. Like, he really did not like human beings. Freud's kind of conclusions were that people are irrational, right? There's no logical sense, and we just cannot be trusted. we can't. This was his conclusion. And so one of the kind of points that Freud came to is that we should basically be managed. We should use psychology and psychoanalysis to influence people to be better. And effectively, the conclusion that Bernays came to is that we can do that through consumerism. So by getting people to buy stuff that they don't need, that they want, they will be distracted, and that they will actually focus on that. They won't focus so much on day-to-day stuff. And that kind of frees up governments, businesses to just kind of do what they want to do because they know best, and your average person is completely irrational. And this became known as something Bernays called the engineering of consent, right? And there's huge issues with this as well, other than the fact that you weren't being treated as a rational human being. You can imagine that a lot of the psychology and what was right and what was wrong and what was okay with your desires really came from the standards of the time. So things like homosexuality, for example, was something